One. Hi, everybody. So this is Rage Crit, podcast for the young, politically minded, and this is our second ever guest, my first professor. So, well, one of my favorite professors in college, my international relations professor. He just knows all about, foreign policy, and I feel I got him on this podcast this week because I feel as the Iraq war kind of gets a little memory hold in young people's minds, because although it wasn't too long ago, it might seem like it was decades ago when it was only like 15 years ago. And I was like, man, who else would be better to talk about this than my international relations professor? Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Sam Greene. I'm an assistant professor of political science, global studies, and geography here at Shepherd University, and I'm also the director of Shepherd Study Abroad program. I previously worked for the Defense Department, so I traveled a lot in the Middle East, and I wrote a book criticizing American foreign policy, including in Iraq. Okay. And thanks for the plug for me as an old person who remembers Iraq.
Okay. Okay. All right, that goes perfectly for first question I'll ask you. Is just straight up. This is for young people, of course, and seeing as you're not an old man. You're probably like what, about my age in 2003. What were your feelings as a young man in 2003 when the Iraq War first began?
Sure. Yeah. So I was a freshman in college. I was a freshman in college in 2002. So we were having this discussion in 2003. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that young people often forget is the war was really popular. So I was kind of skeptical about the war, and I was very much in a minority position, although I was attending a Quaker college. And if you look at the opinion polls, the popular opinion, I support the war, was in the 70s at the start, 72% in March 2003. So at the start, the war is very popular, and it really takes until 2005, 2006 till the majority of people in America turn away from the war. So, I mean, I think more young people than older people were skeptical at the time, but it was something where after 9/11, a lot of people were caught up into, I'm going to support the war, supporting that as supporting America.
Okay. I'll follow up on that. Can you explain to the young people that may not know why many people felt that Iraq was involved in 9/11? Just dispel that real quick.
Sure. So, of course, the majority of the hijackers involved in 9/11 were Saudi nationals, not Iraqis. Mm-hmm. So the attacks were, of course, planned by al-Qaeda, who had sanctuary in Afghanistan. So the first action of the Bush administration was to remove the Taliban government in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. But the Bush administration began to make an argument, sort of a three-part argument, that Iraq had been somehow providing support to al-Qaeda, and then second, that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction that could provide an existential threat to the United States. And third, that spreading democracy in the Middle East would make a more peaceful region and make an event like 9/11 much less likely to happen in the future. But there was definitely an argument from the Bush administration about weapons of mass destruction, and an argument trying to connect Iraq to al-Qaeda. In the end, of course, both of those connections, the Iraq al-Qaeda piece, the weapons of mass destruction piece, turned out not to be accurate. Yeah. But the reason that people thought that was that it was a narrative being driven by the leadership advocating for the war.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I'm just gonna put my 2 cents in. There's a lot of 9/11 conspiracy theories that are pretty dumb, pretty dangerous, but I don't know. I feel that the Iraq had something to do with 9/11, maybe the most dumb and the most dangerous of them all conspiracy theories of 9/11, but I don't know. I just feel like you can't even really say that.
I mean, maybe it's more pernicious
Mm-hmm.
because it was advocated for by people like the Vice President of the United States.
Yes.
And that some of the more fringe conspiracy theories were obviously at the fringe, but this was an idea that was defended by senior American politicians, arguing that the intelligence supported it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Um, so the recent passing of Colin Powell and Donald Rumsfeld, because I can remember not that long ago where these were two men that were kind of reviled in the main discourse in the United States. But I feel like more so with Colin Powell than Donald Rumsfeld, even though it's kind of helped them both, or I guess with the passing of years, their approval ratings and just overall approval by the general public has improved kind of drastically with the passing of the decades. And if you were to watch CNN or any other mainstream publication or news source, when they passed away, they were kind of celebrated in a way. And this is happening with a lot of neocons that were involved in the war in Iraq. Like now Max Boot is on CNN, Brett Stevens is in the New York Times, Bill Kristol's on MSNBC, et cetera, et cetera. Do you feel like the shot, I guess the dirt from the Iraq war that stained their legacy is dissipating through time, or would you argue a different way?
I mean, I guess there's two things. One is how you fit a bad mistake within someone's legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And the second is whether there was learning. So I'm going to first separate Powell and Boot from the other three, because Powell and Boot both have acknowledged that they were wrong about the war,
Mm-hmm.
that they regretted it. Powell in particular did a lot of soul searching about his involvement in the war.
Mm-hmm.
But Boot too said, he has since left the Republican Party, has said, I was wrong not just about the Iraq war, but about neoconism, about my assumptions, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, I think it makes sense to regard someone like that differently. I mean, I have the luxury as a professor that I don't have to make the decisions. I just get to write about them. So
Mm-hmm.
if I were sitting in the cabinet, I might have gotten something wrong. I might have sided with Joe Biden and said no to the Osama bin Laden raid. And in retrospect, that would have been a bad call on my part. But I just get to be the Sunday morning quarterback, so to speak. But that being said, I think if you look at Powell in particular, if you look at all the things he did, for example, first Black chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and just such a positive role model. I think you could say that Powell had a lot of accomplishments in the Iraq War as a stain, and he has said so, but I don't think it should obscure his other accomplishments. And if you read their obituaries, Powell's talks about all his accomplishments, whereas the title of Rumsfeld's obituary in the New York Times, Rumsfeld, Defense Secretary during Iraq War.
Yeah.
And part of this is Rumsfeld had this never say I'm sorry. The world is a better place because we removed Saddam Hussein. He was sort of defiant about that. So from that perspective, I think what's problematic is not making a foreign policy blunder, but the refusal to learn from it and the insistence that that's correct.
But there's this other view of like the average Iraqi citizen who would probably, even with all the apologetics of Powell and Max Boot, the apologetics of the Iraq war, they would probably argue that it doesn't matter if you're sorry about it because you did it, you know? And I feel and many other leftists feel as if even if there's like apologetic for the Iraq war, I feel like it should be maybe the main talking point of their legacy, as in, yes, they probably knew they did a mistake, but with that being said, there was really no real justice served on these figures. But I think they're just maybe just a different irreparable view on how maybe we see the world, you know?
I mean, so I see where you're coming from. At the same
Mhm.
point, do you think Barack Obama's legacy should be, you know, all the people killed by Bashar al-Assad in Syria and all the people who died in the civil war in Libya? I mean, which were both
Yes, I do.
disasters.
I do.
So I think we can be consistent, but then
Mhm.
I think basically we're going to say then that Bill Clinton's legacy is Srebrenica and Rwanda. Um, Bush's legacy, Bush 41's legacy, are, you know, we can point to a bunch of circumstances, but particularly all the people killed in the uprisings after the first Gulf War.
Mhm.
You know, Reagan, we can pin a bunch of things on. So I think pretty much any recent American president, we can say made a foreign policy failure that killed lots and lots of people.
Mhm.
Maybe that's an indictment of how a superpower does foreign policy.
Mhm.
Um, but I would say I think you have to look maybe not just at the learning, but I think learning is important because it hopefully can change the way we do foreign policy in the future.
Mhm.
But I think anyone who has lots of power is going to have a complicated and imperfect legacy. At
Yeah.
least that's just my take.
Okay. Okay. Uh, I think that would just be an indictment on like what you said, the how the superpower conducts itself in the world. Um, because every president since I don't know, since maybe post World War II, when America really became a superpower, probably has some dirt in their legacy, foreign policy wise. So I feel as if that should be first and foremost of their legacy. So I don't know. You can't really separate the two in my view. But I just think that's an agree to disagree thing between me and you. Just because like politicians, they will say they learn from the past, but not really. Because Obama would say he learned from Bush, but Obama continued the drone program that killed, mostly civilians. And Trump, he had like um, an irrational foreign policy that kind of changed every once in a while, And I just feel as the superpower, there should be less grace on these people because every decision that they make affects millions of people who never wanted to be, who never asked for this. So I just think I understand where you're coming from, but I guess just agree to disagree. But this is good. This is good. I like this. Okay. So this is going to tie back to the first question I asked you of the popularity of the Iraq war. And it kind of ties back to the last question of lessons learned. Do you think that the media learned anything from the opening years of the Iraq war, like how to cover military conflict, how to cover military conflict for the most part? That's question one. Do you think they learned anything?
I mean, I think what's different is how different the media ecosystem and environment is.
Mm-hmm.
This is before social media. And so you have to realize that difference. This is very much, I mean, yes, there were some sort of alternative news blogs, but there was, I think, much more a small number of speakers speaking received wisdom about the news. So in that respect, not sure we can talk about drawing lessons from the Iraq War because the media environment is so different. I will say that I think the one difference is that when Colin Powell got up, and you can see there's a famous picture, Powell speaking at the UN, behind him is George Tenet, who was the CIA director, and Powell made him sit there and basically vouch for the intelligence that was not true. There was not a sense that the American establishment and the most respected person would stand up in the UN and present intelligence that was not true. And I think now you have much more of a don't believe anything the government, or at least the party you don't like, says. And I think some of that is a consequence of the Iraq War. And that's not necessarily a media thing, that's a how we consume information thing.
Okay, cool. So like we talked about earlier, you were a freshman in 2002. Of course, I was born in 98, so I don't remember any of this. But when I often hear about the Iraq War, and when they talk about how popular it was there any media coverage of like anti-war people, like anti-war voices on mainstream news? Or of course there's demonstrations, but was that like big news? Was that like, front page?
Yeah, there was definitely news coverage. You also have to remember that there was, so by context, I grew up in Eugene, Oregon. It's a very, very liberal town. And yet, you had this outpouring of American flags that I've never seen before or after. So yeah, there were coverage of the anti-war protests, and you see the huge protest in London, the huge protest in DC. But I don't think that there was a sense that that really reflected public opinion. There are also plenty of pro-war, I don't know what you want to call them, demonstrations as well. So I don't think this was certainly there was backlash against prominent people who spoke out against the war at the start. But I don't think there was any sense of we're not going to cover this. I think I was clearly aware that there were protests.
Okay. How are they portrayed in media?
I mean, it depends on what media you're reading.
Yeah.
Right? I think there is also sort of this sense that war is going to be inevitable.
Oh.
So it's a little bit like this, trying to plug the faucet with your hand, so to speak.
Really? I never really seen that like point of view, the inevitability of war with Iraq, because usually it seems like it's like either or when people talking retrospectively, like we could have invaded or not. But I never knew that.
Well, inevitably, this is maybe me as a political scientist speaking, but inevitable in that I think there was a sense that there was not much, as the American and British governments were making the case for war, this long period of lining everything up. There is, at least for me, there was a sense that, whether it was a million here, a million there protesting, that the administration was going to go ahead.
Yeah. It's funny that you bring up your hometown in Oregon, the liberal hometown, because I remember when I was like maybe 7th or 8th grade, I watched the man with the glasses. Sorry, I'm blanking on him now. He's kind of a bigger guy. He's very liberal. He had a documentary. Bowling for Columbine was one.
Yeah, no, I know who you're talking about. Michael Moore.
Michael Moore. I watched the Michael Moore documentary. I think Whose Country Is It Anyways, or something like that. I can't remember. But a lot of it like flew over my head because I was like 12 or 13. But one of the things that stuck with me was he accepted an award for the documentary, and he went to like retrieve the award, and he was getting booed by the the so-called liberal elites of Hollywood at the time. And that's like shocking. I can't see like a current Republican president having a major initiative, like it could be war policy or anything, and them supporting it now. So it's just, I don't know. I can't even like put myself in 2003 brain. You know what I'm saying?
Well, you have to go back to 9/11, right?
Mhm.
How profoundly that shook Americans. And I think that's I think something that, and now I will sound like an old person, but that's something that the generation of college students now don't understand, the way that that sort of shook America. The 90s were this post-Cold War confidence. America is the best. I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying this is sort of the narrative.
Yes. Mhm.
And when that narrative was undermined, then Bush said, "You're with us or against us," and that,
Mhm.
I think, resonated with a lot of people
Okay.
that today that never would resonate with.
Okay. This is a follow-up question to that. Like, when would you say that switch, like the 9/11, like rally the flag thing kind of started like peeling off of America?
2004,
2004.
because it becomes apparent
Mm-hmm.
that the pitch, links to Al Qaeda, weapons of mass destruction, don't seem to be true, as the American forces are coming Iraq and no one seems to be able to come up with the weapons of mass destruction.
Wow.
I mean, and this was the very, very close, a very contested 2004 election that Bush won very marginally, was in many ways a referendum on the war. But of course, Kerry had voted for the war, and that damaged him to some extent as a messenger against it.
Okay. All right, this next question relates a lot to, well, our first real question, the Colin Powell question. So this current Democratic primary, Joe Biden, of course, came out the winner. The Iraq War is pretty unpopular amongst Democrats, of course, at least here in retrospect. But I can't really remember a time when the Iraq War was really broached at all during the Democratic primary. And I feel that if the Democratic Party doesn't really bring it up as often, then that might say something as a nation as the whole. Do you think that the Iraq War still plays a part in American discourse, or is it a little bit memory old?
Not as much. It was an issue in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
Obama hammered Hillary Clinton on that, and Clinton was a bit annoyed because, of course, Obama didn't have a position where he had to make a vote
Yeah.
on the war one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's now so long ago that it's, I mean, it's certainly part of our memory, but it's much more a historical event.
Yes.
I also think that, someone like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren didn't want to hammer Biden on the Iraq War, in part because how important it was on the Democratic side for whoever the Democratic candidate was to win. So you had a fairly nice campaign. I think they're, under other circumstances, if Mitt Romney had been president,
Mm-hmm.
you might have seen a nastier Democratic primary.
Yes. I think it's funny that you brought up the Obama was against the Iraq War because he didn't have like a position to really enact it or whatever. It's funny because you'll still see that now today, even because I remember in Massachusetts, one of the younger Kennedys was running against Ed Markey, and Ed Markey is pretty left, generally speaking, in America terms. And he criticized him on the Iraq War, but one of his comebacks was like, you weren't even like, you were in college in 2003, you would have voted for it too. So I don't know. I just thought that connection was really funny.
I mean, Ed Markey's interesting because he's reinvented himself as a liberal. If you look at his voting record over time, you wouldn't necessarily think that.
Really?
Yeah. I don't think the Iraq War is the only thing that's not necessarily a liberal position.
Mm,
I think as Massachusetts has wanted someone who's more liberal, he's become that person.
okay.
Maybe a bit of an aside.
Yeah, I know. Just an aside. But I mean, hey, it's my podcast, so asides are fun. Okay. So this next set of questions are more about the implications for the future. Um, so both North Korea and Iran state the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and here's another aside, but the 2011 ousting of Gaddafi as one of the main reasons for pursuing nuclear weapons to deter any future preemptive strikes like what Iraq saw in 2003 from the United States. Do you empathize with this rationalization at all, or is this just more crazy talk from?
Well, in international relations terms, it's logical, right? There's this whole branch, for those of you who didn't have my international relations class or are listening to this, in international relations theory called neo or structural realism, that where one of its foremost authors, Ken Waltz, said basically the world would be safer if everyone had nuclear weapons, because then who would risk nuclear war? It wouldn't be logical if states prioritize survival. So sure, if you were thinking about that from a deterrence perspective, there's no way that a small state like Iran can have anything close to the power of the United States, or maybe even other regional rivals, except for nuclear weapons. On the other hand, given the bad behavior of both of these regimes outside the country, it's hard to think that that's really the only reason why the countries want nuclear weapons or other dubious weapons programs. Because both of these countries have done all sorts of bad things, from targeted assassinations to supporting international terror, et cetera, outside of their own countries. So on one hand, it's logical for a country to say, I want nuclear weapons for deterrence. Given both these regimes' track records, I'm not sure it's completely satisfactory.
Okay. So a lot of these questions, I wrote them up to be, they're mostly focused on like the liberal side of the Iraq war. So because my podcast is generally for, young people. Young people are usually more liberal. And I think I see this now, maybe not as often as I did maybe in 2016, but so I'm like random Instagram stories. It would be al-Assad in Syria. He would use maybe chemical weapons or just do nasty things to his people. And it would be everywhere. Like on social media, there would be people my age posting things like, we must do something in Syria. We must da 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 da, or we must do something in Yemen. We must intervene in such and such and such. And this would be prominent in liberal circles. And this was prominent for liberals at the time in 2003, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, Joe Biden, so on and so forth, of, yes, we think war is ugly. We think it's bad. However, we must intervene on humanitarian grounds. Do you think that the liberals at this time who did support the war on humanitarian grounds, do you think that they had a good case? Which, I mean, it'd be hard to argue against. It was Saddam Hussein, of course, an evil man. But second off, do you believe them that they did do this off of humanitarian grounds?
Sure. And I mean, I think even some Republicans who supported the war are supporting the war because Saddam Hussein is a terrible guy who kills his own people, who, let's remember, invaded Kuwait already. And in terms of the even nasty dictators scale, is a pretty terrible leader. So sure, I think this is not, humanitarian intervention at the time is not just a liberal argument. Right? Sometimes because of Trump, we think that that's only a liberal argument, but it certainly wasn't the case in 2003. And you also have to go back to Rwanda. right? So the lesson of the 90s, Rwanda, then Srebrenica, is that when the United States in specific and developed countries more generally don't intervene in bad situations, then genocide happens. So there's this whole idea of the responsibility to protect. There's this whole idea that powerful countries have responsibility toward humanitarian intervention. And studying a political science doctorate in the 2007 to 2011, right? There's this talk about what the future of humanitarian intervention is. It was sort of this received concept, and even as Iraq started to go bad, it was more of a how do we fix this rather than a this is absurd. What really kind of undermines it is Libya. So I would think it would be hard to find anyone unless they were directly responsible for the Obama administration's Libya policy to say that it was successful. And the challenge is that if you don't intervene, you can get Rwanda, and if you do intervene, you can get Libya or Iraq. And this is, for me, it's one of the lessons of international politics is that even if you're a superpower, there are a lot of things that you can't do either way. Now in Rwanda, I think that the US working with the UN probably could have stopped the genocide. The Rwandan genocide was a low-tech genocide. It wasn't against a powerful or effective state. But when you look at intervening in Syria, right, what is the price you're willing to pay for an intervention that might not work? And I think that's often missing from the discussion. So I will just be honest, I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump. But in terms of Donald Trump's suspicion about American involvement abroad, I don't like the language he used. I don't like the assumptions he's made about a lot of other countries and people groups. But I think the question about what intervention is going to get you, which Biden and Trump have both raised, is one area where I'm sympathetic to, again, not necessarily what Trump said, but some of the thinking behind that.
Okay. All right. It's going to be my last question. This ties into the last question, actually. But saying that with the lessons hopefully learned from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, what do you think the Middle East policy should be post the Iraq War?
So this is a problem. The region was broken, would be pretty broken despite what the US has done, but I don't think it's controversial to say now that the US has made things worse in the region. Yeah, but it's the question is what the US could actually do to make things better. And that's where it's a challenge. Because a lot of the actors that have been empowered in the Middle East are, the word I want to use is maybe have malign intentions in Iraq, outside of Iraq. Is that now we have the Taliban have sort of this precarious control over Afghanistan, which might end up turning into yet another civil war in Afghanistan. We have sort of this consistent challenge of establishing a government in Iraq, and some of the people who are in the government in Iraq are some of the people who were planting IEDs in the 2000s and trying to kill American soldiers, and some other ones are very, very close to Iran, who's questionably increased its influence in Iraq. The question is then what can be done? So sometimes we talk about spending money in the Middle East, but I'm not sure that there is a vehicle for the United States to meaningfully spend money in either of these countries. I mean, the US spent trillions of dollars theoretically in aid to Afghanistan. But we saw in a number of cases, some research I did for my book, where you actually look at Afghans who are asked, do you have better access to education? Do you have better access to water? Do you have better access to healthcare? That in many cases, the answers were about the same after several years of America flooding money theoretically to improve conditions. So that's, and I'm going to tie this now to political science. One of the big enduring problems in the Middle East is governments that don't work for the people and often don't really work at all.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge is, I don't think American money is the way to solve that. But without solving that, I don't think there's that much that American money is going to do usefully in the region. So this is kind of the catch-22, if you will. I think going forward, the United States needs to try to empower better actors, but there's a lot of limitations to how the US can do in general, and particularly now, because the US credibility has been so extraordinarily damaged in the region. I would say the biggest hope for the region is not America. The biggest hope for the region are the young people in the region, some amazing people in a bunch of different countries that I've met, and the hope that they will be able to do better when they get a chance to govern.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's a very interesting episode. I'm very happy that I got you on this episode. Would there be anything you would like to say to the listeners?
Sure. So, as a somewhat older person, I'd say sometimes you can look at something like Iraq and say, politics just sucks. You can be sort of very cynical, and then sort of want to tune it out. And I would say we recognize, of course, there's only so much that one person can do. But I'd say the more young people's voices and what young people want are heard, are raised, I would say, the more that they're heard. And the more young people are involved in politics, are involved in talking to their representatives, vote, the more that your interests in foreign policy, as in everything else, reflected. And so I think that's my number one message is, if you're kind of angry after you've heard this, the solution isn't to tune out. The solution is to be more involved.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That's why I called it Rage Quit. Thank you. All right. Well, I really appreciated this. My listeners really appreciated this. Do you have anything to plug?
Well, I would plug my book, but I don't know what I did with my copy. Just a second. Let's see.
Okay.
Here. Well, I don't know what I did with my copy of my book. This is the messy office. I did write a book that addresses both Iraq and Afghanistan. The title is Pathological Counterinsurgency. And they just reduced the price on the ebook, which is
okay.
Nice.
Cool.
It may be, I don't know if Shepherd's Library bought a copy or not. But if you're a Shepherd student and the library doesn't have it, you can pester them.
Okay, I'll put that in the link.
Okay, and I can.
What's the title?
Do you want me to send you the link?
Yes, please.
Yeah, the title is Pathological Counterinsurgency.
Pathological Counterinsurgency. Let me write that down. Writing a book, that's crazy. How long did it take you?
So it got published in 2018. I think I started writing it in 2015.
2015.
See, it's kind of expensive. They said they were going to reduce the price of the ebook, but it's still really expensive. So I don't know that any of you students should go out and buy that. But ask the library to get a copy if they don't. There's also there's also an article. It's about 20 pages, and if any of your listeners want to, they can send me an email. You can find me on the webpage, and I can send you the short version.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay. Well.
All right. Well, my pleasure. Good luck with capstone, etc. Yeah. Let me know when it goes live.
Okay, I will. It's gonna be a while because course, I need to edit it, and capstone isn't due till maybe like the middle of December sometime. So it's gonna be a while, but when it's on, I will email you. I promise you.
Okay, sounds good. I'll see if I can get you some more listeners.
Thank you so much. All right, that was Dr. Samuel Greene. Take care and go back to grading, please, because I know they're very anxious.
All right, sounds good.
Take care. Have a good Thanksgiving.
Cheers.
All right, bye-bye.